All right, so let's stay on the focus of power this morning. The president announcing several measures to address the energy crisis in the country. It includes the scrapping of licenses for private energy distributors to supply the electricity grid and facilitate importing energy from neighbouring states. That could be very important, won't it be? Aviwe Mtila, eNCA reporter, just getting some reaction for us this morning. Aviwe, hello to you. So I know we'll be talking about the business sector a little bit later, but no doubts unions are going to have a lot to say about this as well, because blackouts lead to job losses. That is a well-known fact.
Yes, Gareth, good morning. And urgently adding much more capacity to the grid that will limit load shedding is what we were promised by the president last night. In fact, this will be achieved by recruiting new skills. In fact, even senior managers that had left Eskom are now being brought back. Also buying electricity from your mines, private companies, as well as neighboring countries is what we were promised, and scrapping of licensing. One of those steps outlined by the president yesterday. But of course, we're trying to get reaction, starting with the South African Federation of Trade Unions, Zwelinzi Mavavi. Lomkhulu, thank you for joining us at eNCA. You heard those plans highlighted by saying that this will limit load shedding. I want to get your reaction firstly to what the president said.
Let me just say that first, SAFTU and a host of other grassroots-based working class formations that have formed a coalition they call the Coalition of the Excluded, have not been consulted. Was hearing about this plan for the first time last night when the president was presenting it. And this is a norm on the part of the president, that perhaps he wants to speak to the people that will agree with him, not those that will have opposite views to those that he represents and or that the ANC government represent in 2022. That's the first point. We have not been consulted. And we are the home of the biggest private sector companies and that are at the epic center of the crisis of load shedding in the mines. AMCU have not been consulted. In the manufacturing space, NUMSA, FAO and others have not been consulted. And this is rather a terrible starting point. You can't want to unite the nation when you can't even consult the most appropriate people, not because you like them, but because you feel obliged morally to speak to those that matter in the economy. The second part, this is a long-term plan that have been started by the ANC government in 1997. Which reminds us of the United States scholar, Noam Chomsky, who normally say your plan to privatize normally involves defunding an institution, making people very angry. And when people's anger is at top levels, as it is in South Africa today as a result of stage 6 load shedding, then you offer privatization as the only solution. Yesterday's statement was pure fastened pace towards handing over energy to the private players to maximize profits and to make money for the shareholders. And all of the steps that have been announced at the center of that is about that. The first one, for example, government used to limit the generation of electricity at 1 megawatts. Before, during the apartheid era and immediately period after the apartheid. It lifted that to 100 and it has now removed that altogether. It means that private firms now are at will to provide, to generate energy at whatever capacity that they may have. Secondly, government have introduced the independent power producers, which it has forced Eskom to subsidize at a very heavy price. If you look at every financial year statement of Eskom, we're subsidizing up to 20 billion rands the independent power producers. Last night was a statement to say we're going to have to see more of that. Thirdly, we are being told that the private firms, including the private residents, can now purchase their own solars and put them in the roofs, can generate that in the mines, in the workplaces, factories, everywhere. And remember, who's have capacity to do that? It is not the black residential areas. It's not the working class. It's going to be the elements of the big business who can afford to buy that. And those now will be free to sell electricity to Eskom. And fourthly, as you are saying, embarrassingly, we're now going to import electricity when we used to export electricity to the neighboring countries. The president is not saying why we're finding ourselves in this situation. Eskom used to be the number one in the world in terms of providing the cheapest electricity, most efficient. It used to be our big attraction of investments into this economy. That advantage is gone.
Clearly, it's failing, Eskom. So aren't these measures then put in place, given the rolling blackout that is hampering our economy at the moment? And, of course, livelihoods of the poorest are being affected the harshest. So aren't these measures done in order to aid even the poor to keep the lights on that will grow the economy?
SAFTU and many of us in the working class formation insist that energy is far too important of a commodity to be handed over to the private sector so that it can be used to maximize profits. Water, education, healthcare, policing or security of the public, you can't hand over those, because before you know it, the rules of the private sector will apply now even on electricity. Those that can afford extremely high prices of electricity will be only ones that have access to electricity, same as those that have extremely high budgets can afford to take their children to the private schools, to the private clinics, and or hire private security firms. We don't want and we don't like the road that we are now traveling. We insist that government must fix its own mess in Eskom. It starts by this massive 400 billion rands of a debt. SAFTU insist that that debt is an odious debt. It should not be paid because the banks knew very well that the ANC government, through its company Hitachi amongst others, were looting the state coffers, were overpricing in Medupi and Kusile, and that they knew willingly that they want to budget and fund corruption. It is that corruption that they have been funding that have now ballooned to the rate of 400 billion rands in debt. We want that debt cancelled altogether, and we want all of the companies, as they are being fined in the United States, such as Hitachi, to be put into prison, all of their directors, including the ANC government itself, because this is their company.
I was about to touch on the debt, but maybe let me close off by asking what should be done. And do you believe that government has the capacity to turn around the woes of Eskom without the help of the private sector, as you allude to?
Just transition is what we are calling for. Just transition will start with a consultation with the stakeholders, not those who you love. The stakeholders will include the communities, the trade unions, the civil society formations, to develop a plan to move South Africa from a current situation of over-reliance, not total exclusion, but over-reliance to fossil fuels, from coal to renewables. And that's what we insist on, because that's the only way we can address our electricity crisis in the home front, but at the same time, we can address the climate change calamity.
Okay, thank you very much, eNCA from the South African Federation of Trade Union. Not happy at all with the president's address and plans to tackle the energy crisis, saying that they weren't included in those conversations.
And we'll continue to get reaction not just from unions, Aviwe, but also business later in the day as well. Aviwe Mtila getting reaction to what I'm calling was a family meeting, a power planning family meeting from the president last night. Lots of plans, but of course we have to unpack that and see how many of them are quickly implementable and how many of them are realistic. We'll continue with that reaction later in the day.